Inside Moms Mabley's abandoned house, secret life, and sad death. Every comedian has a story, but few are as fascinating, heartbreaking, and inspiring as Moms Mabley's. She was one of the first black female stand-up comedians in America, a trailblazer whose wit and wisdom paved the way for generations of performers. Known for her toothless smile, floppy hats, and jokes about chasing younger men, she built a career on laughter. But behind the laughter was pain. Behind the jokes was survival. Behind the stage lights was a woman whose personal life was far more complicated than audiences ever knew. And today, her story lives not only in comedy history but also in the walls of an abandoned house, the once proud home of Moms Mabley. What secrets do those walls hold? What does that decaying structure say about her life, her hidden struggles, and the way she was treated after death? This is not just a story about comedy. It is a story about survival in the face of unimaginable hardship. It is about how a poor black woman born in the early 1900s overcame trauma, racism, and sexism to become one of the most beloved entertainers of her time. And it is also about how fame and wealth could not protect her from sadness, loneliness, and the decline of her final years. As we go inside Moms Mabley's abandoned house, we uncover more than broken wood and peeling wallpaper. We uncover pieces of her soul. We see the contrast between her public success and her private heartbreak, and we reflect on the sad truth that even legends can be forgotten, their legacies neglected as their homes rot into the ground. This is the story of Moms Mabley, her secret life, her abandoned house, and her sad death. It is a story filled with both tragedy and triumph, one that reminds us of the cost of breaking barriers and the fragility of human life, even for those who once stood at the top. Childhood of hardship. Loretta Mary Aiken, who the world would come to know as Moms Mabley, was born in Brevard, North Carolina in 1894. Her childhood was not a happy one. In fact, it was marked by trauma that shaped much of her later life. By the time she was in her early teens, she had experienced a series of devastating events that would break most people. She lost both of her parents at a young age. Her father, a fireman, was killed in an explosion while trying to extinguish a blaze. Her mother was run over and killed by a truck on Christmas Day. On top of these tragedies, Loretta was subjected to horrific abuse. She was raped twice, once by a family member and once by an older man in her community. She bore children as a result of these assaults, and those children were taken from her, never to be raised by her. By the time most teenagers were going to school dances, Loretta was already hardened by grief and trauma. But instead of letting tragedy destroy her, she found and escaped the stage. She ran away from home at just 14 years old and joined a traveling minstrel show. It was there that she reinvented herself, both as a performer and as a person. She changed her name, taking Moms, as a symbol of maternal warmth, and Mabley, from a man she disliked, a way of mocking him while erasing her own painful past. In doing so, she left behind Loretta Mary Aiken, the traumatized girl, and became Moms Mabley, the performer who would make audiences roar with laughter. Her childhood of hardship explains much of her comedy. She often joked about chasing younger men, a way of flipping her past trauma on its head and reclaiming power. Her toothless old woman persona allowed her to say things that other women, especially black women, could never say publicly at the time. In many ways, every laugh she created was built on pain, and every performance was an act of survival. Rise in comedy. By the 1920s, Moms Mabley had begun carving out a career on the vaudeville and Chitlin circuit, a network of theaters and clubs that welcomed black performers in a segregated America. Her timing, wit, and boldness made her stand out. Unlike many female performers of her time who were expected to sing or dance, Moms built her reputation as a comedian. Her toothless, grandmotherly stage persona gave her freedom. On stage, she would joke about politics, race, and relationships in ways that other comedians could not. When she said she preferred young boys, audiences laughed at the absurdity, but beneath the joke was a deeper commentary on gender roles, aging, and sexuality. She used comedy to smuggle in truths about society that would have otherwise been censored. By the 1930s and 1940s, Moms was a star of the Apollo Theater in Harlem, performing regularly and becoming a staple of black entertainment. She worked alongside legends like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Cab Calloway. Her routines made her one of the most popular comedians of her generation. She was also groundbreaking in another way. Moms Mabley was openly lesbian, something almost unheard of in her era. Though she never spoke about it directly on stage, within her personal life she lived authentically, refusing to hide her relationships with women. In an age when being openly gay could end careers, her Moms lived on her own terms. Her rise in comedy was not without obstacles. The entertainment industry was dominated by men, and racism made opportunities for black performers painfully limited. But Moms thrived because she was undeniable. Audiences loved her, and her talent made her indispensable. By the 1960s, when television began to showcase more comedians, Moms transitioned effortlessly. She appeared on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour and The Ed Sullivan Show, bringing her humor to mainstream America. At a time when older women were often pushed aside in entertainment, Moms found a way to be more relevant than ever. She was proof that comedy had no age limit and no gender limit. Her rise was not just personal triumph, it was cultural. She broke barriers for women, for Black performers, and for LGBTQ people, even if audiences did not realize it at the time. Moms Mabley was more than a comedian, she was a pioneer. Secret life and identity. Moms Mabley's comedy persona, the toothless, harmless old woman chasing after young men, was only one side of her identity. Behind the stage mask was a woman who had lived through extraordinary trauma and had constructed a private life that was carefully guarded. Her secret life was not scandalous in the way tabloids might expect. Rather, it was about living authentically in a world that was hostile to who she really was. Moms Mabley was openly lesbian in private circles. She wore men's clothing off stage, loved women openly within her trusted community, and refused to apologize for it. In an era when most entertainers hid their sexuality for fear of being blacklisted, Moms embraced hers with quiet defiance. This freedom came with costs. Outside of her safe spaces, she had to endure the weight of stereotypes and discrimination. Her stage persona was in part a shield. The grandma mask made her less threatening to mainstream audiences while allowing her to say what others could not. By joking about sex, politics, and race from the safety of her character, she was able to be bold without being destroyed. Her identity was also shaped by her early trauma. Having been assaulted and stripped of her children as a teenager, Moms never built a traditional family life. Instead, she poured herself into her work and her chosen family, the friends, fellow performers, and partners who made up her inner circle. The secret life of Moms Mabley is one of resilience. She defied societal expectations not only as a woman, but as a Black lesbian in a segregated, conservative America. Her ability to thrive in comedy while living authentically was groundbreaking, even if mainstream history has not always given her credit for it. To understand Moms Mabley, you have to see both sides: the comedic persona that made millions laugh and the private woman who navigated identity, sexuality, and trauma with courage. The abandoned house she once lived in stands today not only as a physical ruin but as a metaphor for the duality of her life. The public stage versus the private sanctuary. Breaking barriers. Moms Mabley was not just another entertainer, she was a cultural pioneer who broke barriers on multiple fronts. As one of the first Black female stand-up comedians to achieve mainstream recognition, she challenged the assumption that comedy was a man's world. In an era when women were expected to be singers or dancers, Moms made her living on jokes. Her comedy was groundbreaking because it was political without always seeming political. By playing an old woman, she gave herself cover to say things that were otherwise taboo. She cracked jokes about segregation, about politicians, about the absurdity of racism itself. Audiences laughed because she seemed harmless, but the subtext of her comedy carried sharp critique. She was using humor as a weapon against oppression. Moms also broke barriers for LGBTQ representation. Though she never announced it on stage, her private life as a lesbian was an open secret in entertainment circles. She did not conform to gender norms in her daily life, often dressing in men's suits. She lived in a way that challenged the boundaries of what was acceptable, and she did so decades before it became safer to do so. Her success also paved the way for comedians like Richard Pryor, Whoopi Goldberg, and Wanda Sykes. Each of these performers, in different ways, built on Mom's legacy of using comedy to tackle uncomfortable truths. When Whoopi Goldberg created her one-woman show in the 1980s, she cited Moms as a direct influence. Perhaps the most powerful barrier she broke was the one of age. At a time when older women were ignored or pushed aside, Moms turned her age into a punchline and a source of power. Her old lady persona gave her longevity in an industry that usually celebrated youth. In her 60s and 70s, she was performing for mainstream audiences, proving that comedy belonged to everyone, regardless of age. Breaking barriers is not without cost. Moms was not always recognized by the mainstream media during her lifetime. Her contributions were often confined to the Black press or ignored entirely, but history has begun to correct that mistake. Today, comedians and cultural historians recognize that without Moms Mabley, the path for women, for Black performers, and for LGBTQ comedians would have been far more difficult. Inside the abandoned house, when people speak of Moms Mabley today, they remember her laughter, her toothless grin, and her groundbreaking comedy. But tucked away in upstate New York sits a painful reminder of how fleeting fame can be the house she once called home, now abandoned and collapsing into decay. This house, once filled with the sound of her jokes and the warmth of her hospitality, now sits as a silent witness to the passage of time, a shell of what it once was. Neighbors recall that when Moms lived there, the home was vibrant. Friends, fellow performers, and family members came and went. She hosted gatherings where music, laughter, and food filled every corner. The house was a place of community, a retreat where she could escape the pressures of touring and television. For moms who had endured so much hardship in her youth, the house represented stability. It was hers, a piece of comfort in a life that had been anything but easy. But after her death in 1975, the house fell into neglect. Ownership disputes, lack of resources, and disinterest from those who could have preserved it left the property vulnerable. Over the years, it rotted from the inside out. Broken windows, collapsing walls, and overgrown weeds turned what was once a sanctuary into a symbol of abandonment. Walking through the ruins today is chilling. The peeling paint, the scattered furniture, the silence of empty rooms. All of it contrasts with the vibrant woman who once lived there. To stand in that space is to feel the gap between her public legacy and her private decline. It raises uncomfortable questions. Why wasn't her home preserved as a museum? Why was her memory allowed to fade into neglect? The house is more than a building. It is a metaphor for the way society often treats trailblazers. While they are alive, we cheer them. After they are gone, their contributions are sometimes forgotten, their spaces left to rot. Moms Mabley gave the world laughter, but her abandoned home reminds us of the sadness that comes when we fail to honor those who paved the way. Decline and sad death. By the early 1970s, Moms Mabley was in her late 70s, and while her career had seen a resurgence thanks to television appearances, her health was declining. Years of performing, the physical toll of touring, and her own age were catching up with her. Still, she remained active, appearing on stage and even recording music. In 1969, she released a rendition of Braham Martin and John, a tribute to fallen leaders which became a surprising hit. At nearly 75 years old, she became the oldest living person to have a top 40 hit at the time. But behind the success was frailty. Moms had a heart attack during a performance in 1970, yet even that did not keep her away from the stage for long. She pushed herself to keep going, partly out of love for her craft and partly out of necessity. Comedy had been her survival since she was a teenager, and even in old age, she knew no other way of life. Her final years were bittersweet. While she was respected and beloved in the comedy community, she never achieved the financial stability or institutional recognition that her white male peers enjoyed. She continued to perform, sometimes in smaller venues, even as her health weakened. In 1975, Mom suffered another heart attack and passed away at the age of 81. The news shook the entertainment world, but the sadness was compounded by the realization that she did not leave behind the wealth or security her groundbreaking career should have earned her. Unlike many comedians who died surrounded by riches or accolades, Moms Mabley's death carried the sting of unfulfilled recognition. Her funeral was attended by many who admired her, but outside of the black press and comedy circles, her passing did not receive the widespread coverage it deserved. America lost one of its greatest comedic pioneers, but her sad death highlighted the disparity between the barriers she broke and the rewards she received. Legacy in comedy. Though her house may be abandoned and her death overshadowed by neglect, Moms Mabley's legacy is far from forgotten. Her influence reverberates in the voices of countless comedians who followed her path. Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, Whoopi Goldberg, Wanda Sykes, Monique, and many others owe part of their success to the doors Moms opened. She was one of the first comedians to use stand-up as social commentary, cloaking sharp political observations in humor. In this way, she paved the way for Pryor and Carlin to push boundaries. She showed that comedy could be a tool of truth, telling, not just entertainment. Her willingness to speak about race, gender, and sex laid the foundation for modern comedy as we know it. Her courage as an openly lesbian performer, living authentically in her private life, also left a quiet but important legacy. At a time when LGBTQ people were marginalized, Moms proved that a performer could live honestly and still succeed. Her bravery helped normalize what would later become more openly discussed in comedy. Culturally, her work broke stereotypes of women in comedy. She proved women could not only tell jokes but command entire audiences with their wit. For Black women in particular, her success was revolutionary. She became a blueprint for performers like Whoopi Goldberg, who has openly credited Moms as an influence. Today, historians and comedians alike are beginning to give her the credit she always deserved. Documentaries, retrospectives, and tributes have begun restoring her place in comedy history. While her abandoned house tells a story of neglect, her legacy in comedy tells a story of endurance. Otter does not decay like wood and plaster. It echoes, passed from generation to generation, carrying her spirit into the future. Rediscovery and modern recognition. For decades after Moms Mabley's passing, her name faded from the spotlight. While comedy fans of the 1960s and 1970s remembered her, Younger generations grew up without hearing much about the trailblazing woman who had once dominated the Apollo Theater and national television. It seemed that history had left her behind. But slowly, piece by piece, her legacy has been rediscovered and honored, proving that even when society neglects its pioneers, truth has a way of resurfacing. The rediscovery began in the 1980s and 1990s, as comedians like Whoopi Goldberg and Eddie Murphy started referencing moms as a key influence. Whoopi, in particular, spoke often about the importance of Moms Mabley, even dedicating part of her career to bringing her story back into the public eye. In 2013, Whoopi directed a documentary called Whoopi Goldberg Presents Moms Mabley, which introduced her to a new generation. The film not only chronicled her career, but also shed light on her personal struggles, her sexuality, and the cultural barriers she broke. For many younger viewers, this was the first time they truly understood how groundbreaking moms had been. Academics and historians also began to take her work more seriously, analyzing her comedy in the context of race, gender, and sexuality. What had once been seen as simple jokes about young boys was now recognized as subversive social commentary. Scholars pointed out how moms cleverly used her, toothless old lady, persona to critique segregation, racism, and sexism without facing the kind of backlash that would have silenced others. Her comedy was reinterpreted not just as entertainment, but as activism. Modern comedians also carry her spirit forward. Wanda Sykes, Monique, and many LGBTQ comedians have cited moms as proof that authenticity can coexist with success. Her courage to live openly as a lesbian in private, while still commanding respect on stage, has been framed as an act of quiet revolution. The rediscovery of Moms Mabley also raises questions about how we treat our legends. Why did it take so long for her to receive recognition? Why wasn't her home preserved, her career celebrated, and her name taught in history books sooner? The answers are uncomfortable but important. They reveal the intersections of racism, sexism, and homophobia that often bury the legacies of marginalized pioneers. Yet today, more than ever, her story is reaching audiences worldwide. Documentaries, retrospectives, and digital archives ensure that Moms Mabley will not be forgotten again. The rediscovery of her work is more than just nostalgia. It is a correction of history, restoring her to her rightful place among the giants of comedy. Walking through the ruins of Moms Mabley's abandoned house is a haunting experience. The cracked walls, broken furniture, and silence stand in sharp contrast to the life she lived, a life of survival, laughter, and cultural impact. But perhaps the house is not only a symbol of sadness. Perhaps it is also a reminder. Moms Mabley's story forces us to reflect on how we honor those who break barriers. Too often, society celebrates pioneers while they are alive, but lets their legacies fade when they are gone. Her home should have been preserved as a museum, a place where future generations could learn about the woman who brought truth through comedy. Instead, it sits in decay, reflecting the neglect she endured in death. Yet her spirit is not truly abandoned. It lives on in every female comedian who grabs a microphone. It lives on in every black performer who refuses to be silenced. It lives on in every LGBTQ entertainer who chooses to live authentically. Her story resonates because it is one of triumph against unimaginable odds. She turned trauma into humor, pain into resilience, and hardship into laughter. The sad death of Moms Mabley reminds us that legends are human. They suffer, they age, and they are often forgotten by the very systems they helped change. But her laughter still echoes. When you hear a comedian today joke about race, gender, or politics with fearless honesty, you are hearing the influence of Moms Mabley. So as we stand outside that abandoned house, we are left with two choices: to let it remain a ruin, or to honor it as a monument. Not just to a home, but to a life that survived unspeakable pain, that broke barriers, and that gave the world something priceless: laughter. Moms Mabley's secret life and sad death reveal the complexities of a woman who was more than a comedian. She was a survivor, a pioneer, and a legend. And though her house may crumble, her legacy, philanthropy, and quiet generosity, while Moms Mabley made her living with laughter. Those close to her remembered her as someone who gave quietly to those in need. She never had the vast wealth of some of her white male comedy peers. But what she did earn, she often shared. She supported young performers coming up on the Chitlin circuit, paid bills for struggling friends, and gave money to community causes without seeking recognition. For a woman who had known abandonment and poverty firsthand, generosity was her way of breaking the cycle. Her abandoned house may look like a symbol of neglect, but it once sheltered countless people who needed a meal, a place to stay, or simply kindness. That hidden generosity adds another layer to her legacy. She was not only a comedian who broke barriers, but a woman who lived with compassion, even when society gave her little in return. Cultural silence and historical erasure. One of the saddest truths about Moms Mabley's decline is how quickly mainstream culture allowed her to fade. Despite performing for decades, making hit records, and breaking comedy barriers, she was rarely given the accolades that others in her field received. She was not granted the same television specials, book deals, or institutional honors that comedians like Bob Hope or George Burns enjoyed. This erasure was not accidental. It was rooted in racism, sexism, and homophobia. For many years after her death, her name was absent from comedy history books, her contributions overlooked by an industry that profited from her courage. The abandonment of her house is not just about one neglected property, it is a metaphor for how marginalized pioneers are too often treated by history. Rediscovering Moms Mabley means confronting that silence and correcting it, restoring her name to the place it always deserved among the greats of American comedy.